Good evening, everyone, and welcome to, I can't believe I'm saying it, round 4 of Rebellious Research Seminar Series. I cannot believe we've been running it for 4 years, so I'm immensely grateful today to Lee Jane, who is a really good friend of mine, collaborator, and a fantastic academic and filmmaker, who's gonna open our round 4 today with her talk on exploring the intellectual dimensions of fiction filmmaking, why fiction filmmaking matters. Now, before I pass it on to you, Lee Jane, and before I introduce you very briefly on a second slide, I just wanted to kind of very shamelessly plug in a book we are writing together. And I know there's some people who just joined the meeting who are going to be part of the book. So we are embarking on a project which is to do with exploring fiction filmmaking as form of research. So this is just something which is in a pipeline, and I'm going to be really, really shamefully just waving this to the camera. So that's a book which I recently published, which is on filmmaking in academia, just because I think it really relates to the topic of what this series is about and the reason why we're doing what we're doing here. So without further ado, just very quickly, let's introduce Lee Jane. So Lee Jane, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm running from 2 computers, so that's what happens when you do so. So Lee Jane is an independent filmmaker and experienced academic who currently works at the Open University, setting up a new curriculum in film and media. She has produced and directed short fiction films that have been showcased on the UK television at prestigious festivals, including Edinburgh, Brooklyn, and Cork. Her latest work, which we'll hear quite a lot about tonight, About the Night, has garnered acclaim, winning Best Story at the British International Film Festival and receiving nominations for Best Narrative Short Film at the Miami Women Film Festival, New York Art House Film Festival, and nominated for Best Female Director at the European Short Awards. In academic context, the film was nominated for Best Practice Screen-Based Award Research Award even, at short categories at BAFTs, and it was being screened at Media Fictions in Sweden, the Experimental Fiction Film Festival in Manchester, and also as part of the MEXA conference in Manchester in earlier this year. So that's about it for now. I'm just going to stop sharing, and it's all yours, Lee Jane, for about next hour or so.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that takes out a few of my slides now, so that's quite good. Let me share my screen. Let me know if this works. Fingers crossed. You're never quite sure, are you? All good. Let's go to presentation mode. It's going slow though. Come on. Right. Can you see that nicely now? Is it all nice and neat? Good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, we're here to talk about my research around this short fiction film About the Night. And I suppose I'm focusing in today mostly, but not purely. I'll go off in some directions because I've learned so much from doing this research. I'm exploring the intellectual dimensions of fiction filmmaking and why fiction filmmaking matters, because it's really important to me, but it's also what I've come to understand from making this film and putting myself in this situation as an embedded researcher, which has been fascinating. So my aims really for this seminar are to talk about fiction filmmaking as rebellious research. Yay. I never do anything else though. I don't mean to be rebellious, honestly. Well, that's what I used to say to my teachers anyway, but I kind of always end up being there. But I also want to discuss being a practice-led researcher, which I think is really important, and as particularly being embedded in this production as a director and producer of this short film About the Night. I'm going to play a clip for you, not the whole thing, but I will play the start so that we can have a look what I've been talking about. And then I also want to sort of really illustrate the sort of kind of messy research process, really. And it is messy, but it's essentially messy. It's on purpose. It's kind of called creativity, and it's how we work. So we have to embrace the mess. So introduction wise, I don't really have to say too much because you've done such a wonderful job for me, Agatha. But I just did want to say that I've been focusing in on fiction filmmaking for many years now, although I have worked across documentary and fiction. In fact, when I first started out as a professional, I worked in radio, which seems unusual, I know. Unusual to link it to film, but back then, way back when, we were really interested in putting creative packages together and kind of painting images out of just sound. So it wasn't just interviews and news and people's opinions. It really was some interesting, I think, innovative radio with a lot of sound design and a lot of storytelling going on. And it's that moulding of the two really that shaped me into kind of the person, the creative professional that I am, and also the kind of educator that I am. So that context then, this project is part of a larger practice-led research initiative, and I'm hoping that there's going to be a couple of more short films. I've learned a lot from doing About the Night, but I'd like to kind of up the ante in terms of the research methods and what I'm doing. I've also learned a lot and what I need to put in place for next time. My aim is focusing in on the process of fiction production and its implications, particularly around equality and inclusion, as well as pushing the boundaries of storytelling within narrative film. So there's these two kind of pronged approaches that I've got, which is the production side itself, and then also the storytelling side to it and pushing narrative boundaries. So this research is still ongoing, and therefore today represents part of a much bigger series of outputs, including, as Agatha mentioned, the co-edited book Fiction Filmmaking, where I hope to go into a lot more detail about some of these things that I've found through the making. But in terms of About the Night, I utilised a process-led reflexive praxis, which I will continue to use throughout the other films if I can get funding to make them. Say it and I will put it into practice, right? It will happen. My overall approach is to explore and foster a deeper engagement within the academy around fiction filmmaking. And one of my aims with this particular film was to be more daring with the storytelling, pushing the boundaries of form, style, and narrative structure without actually pushing it towards being purely experimental. So being rebellious and taking creative risks is not necessarily easy within fiction filmmaking. We are often constrained by limited resources and industry gatekeepers, which I find leads to the perpetuation of formulaic storytelling and limits the diversity of the stories we tell. Now, this book, Patricia Levy has written Fiction as Research Practice, is about novel writing, prose writing, but it's just such a wonderful, helpful book in terms of fiction and research. She says that fiction is a wonderful tool for getting at the complexities of lived experience and helping others to learn and feel. And I thought that really kind of epitomizes what I was after and what I'm trying to do with my films. So hopefully today I'll present you with my argument for why fiction filmmaking has academic research value, as it is inherently, I think, academic, intellectually critical work where we are creating new knowledge in what we make. So not just what we say around the product or the film, but actually in the product itself. So I aim to explore then with this film the creative process of producing and directing a fictional short film, while also challenging the conventional view that fiction lacks this academic research value. That was a big part of what I was interested in. Working in a professional manner, but outside of an industry context, my goal was to identify barriers to innovation during the creative process. So one of my initial research questions, although I've got to say, you must note this, those of you who are embarking on this kind of research, this is much more articulated, well articulated, should I say, now than it was when I started out. I kind of knew that this was the area I was interested in, and this is where the research was going and why I wanted to do it. However, how can the dynamics of the production process be rethought to broaden creative leadership in fiction filmmaking and foster more innovative and inclusive storytelling? As a question has been really articulated just recently. So just those of you who are out there who are not, I don't know quite how to shape this or gives the perfect question, don't worry. It will come to you, and you can work that out as you go along, honestly, no matter who tells you what. Sometimes, though, we do have to have something on paper for funders, for supervisors, but it can change. That's the thing you can note, really. I also aim to explore how filmmakers who challenge existing norms to tell stories from different perspectives might achieve their goals. Now, I'm not sure I've actually been able to nail that down quite just yet. This kind of stuff is still ongoing. But my starting point stemmed from an awareness that not everyone aspiring to become a key creative in fiction filmmaking, no matter how talented, will have the opportunity to establish a successful career, especially if they pursue projects that push creative boundaries. So additionally, given that even art house cinema adheres to traditional storytelling norms these days, maybe there's the occasional breakthrough. A second question arose as I continually tried to work out how to shape this research. How can we break free from conventional constraints to encourage a more inclusive and innovative approach to filmic storytelling? Right. What really interested me is with fiction, we've kind of got an infinite sense, an infinite choice really of possibilities where we can go, and yet it's really interesting how restricted it is to sort of codes, conventions, and a structure for how we tell our stories. Here, Mark Lorenz talks about a film is an immensely complex product integrating numerous art forms such as writing, design, and performance art, and the scope for combining the inputs in order to achieve new content varieties are, in Cave's words, infinite. Well, that's just kind of amazing, really, that if it is, then if it offers this scope for new content creation with this infinite potential, how then are we so restricted? I want to suggest that within narrative fiction, as it stands right now, there is limited room for experimentation or different creative stories or voices. And if fiction reflects our ideas and our fears, our aspirations as a society, it's kind of essential that that broadens out really to different types of stories and different people who are telling them. So on to About the Night then, as a story. About the Night is about a belligerent young waiter and a woman seeking solace in a late night cafe. The theme underlying the story that I always ran with as the director for the pitch was that small acts of kindness can change the world. I was definitely leaning into the notion of small acts all the way through this, and I'll come on to that in a bit when I talk about story structure. So the script was inspired by a real event that the writer and myself witnessed in a cafe many years ago, where a young woman was unable to really eat a piece of cake that she'd bought, that she'd had in a paper bag, but she'd sat down in the cafe with her coffee and the brown paper bag. And she really wrestled with opening the bag. She even took photographs of the cake, and it was quite clear that she wasn't well and she wasn't eating. So it was actually really hard to watch, and this moment stayed with us. And months later, after the writer read Ernest Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, these two things, the event and what he read when he read this short story, came into being really, and became the building blocks that inspired the story and the storytelling as well. So in these early stages of developing the script, the writer experimented with the narrative, navigating the best way to articulate his interaction with what he'd seen in the cafe and what had moved him in terms of the Hemingway short story. And this is how creatives work, really, isn't it? It's this negotiation with what we need to get out of us, and the way we need to get it out, and the things that have inspired us to do that. When I became involved to develop the story, it was a labour of love, really. So when we developed this together, I wasn't really thinking about research, not in a formal sense anyway. But eventually I recognised the value of understanding this whole process and began shaping it as research. Partly because it took us so long to actually find snippets of time to work on this alongside a normal working life and raising a child. So as the director then, I approached production wanting to create a sense of verisimilitude grounded in our initial empathetic response to the woman in the cafe, in the real life event. So this approach continued to shape how I worked with both the cast and the crew as we collectively engaged with the script. Now, the pandemic, it delayed production and prevented us from casting the female lead in person. We actually were able to land our older gentleman and our young waiter. But as things transpired, we got stuck inside and weren't able to see people in person. So through video meetings, I saw a lot of women for this role of Mia. Abigail, though, as you can see here, who is the actress who made the final stage of the film, she really stood out, and I'm taking this from my notes and from my memory, and I'll mention that in a bit when I talk about research methods. Her empathy for the character was remarkable. When she expressed how deeply she felt Mia's loneliness and pain, it illuminated an emotional depth I hadn't fully grasped at that point. She had this idea that as Mia pushes away the cake, because that stays true, it's in the film, how she's actually rejecting rewarding herself or giving herself that bit of comfort food. And it took my breath away at the time talking to her. And looking back at my notes, she also described that the script was an invitation for the audience to spend time with the characters, which captures well, I can't, looking back on it now, I can't believe it, because it captures something that I didn't understand myself back then, and I've only just started to come to understand, is that my whole filmmaking journey is making films that are like, come to the fireside and let's have a talk about this kind of films. So to look back at those notes and see that she saw it in the script before I did is quite amazing. So as a director then, I wanted to create an experiential window on a moment that matched the tone of the script. Although my perspective on the story differed somewhat from the writers, and we've talked about this a lot, our collaboration felt very productive. They may be slightly different, but it was a positive difference. While the script read beautifully right from the start, perhaps more poetic than a narrative-driven piece, I actually pushed for revisions towards a more conventional structure with a clear protagonist. So what you've got here when you see the script, it's the start of the script, is that I added a character that the writer hadn't, which was a girlfriend for our young waiter, Josh. What you have here is what we shot, but doesn't make it into the film, this dialogue, interestingly. I'll come back to that later. Although the writer resisted at first the more conventional things that I wanted to try and edge in, we negotiated and we compromised and eventually worked in this more conventional structure. However, really interesting, midway through the editing, after going through, I mean, it took us a couple of years in the end to fully make this film with the pandemic and all the setbacks. But and actually, the first time we got COVID was when we had a major push on the edit, and that was the only time we had to work on it properly, was because the writer and I are partners and we're able to sit at the kitchen table and work on the edit. But halfway through that process, I realised that the traditional storytelling conventions were compromising the film's integrity. And while not a direct adaptation of Hemingway, the film needed to share its more experimental nature with an emphasis on mood and setting rather than plot. So as a director then, I was faced with this intricate balancing act, really, of connecting the story to the audience and trying to figure out, well, how do you do that if you're not so wedded to your usual traditional structure of storytelling? And crafting a film that captures a moment in time and invites empathy for a quite unconventional character in Mia, all the while preserving the film's integrity. And when I say that, I suppose I'm thinking about that initial empathy and response that we had to this woman in the cafe and her struggle with food. And while I regret really forcing this conventional narrative structure on the script, it did prove valuable both for the research process and for learning, both our learning, the writer and myself's learning, because it meant that we came into our own really in that edit room and started feeling much more confident in pushing the boundaries. Maybe we would have felt like we were rescuing a film if we hadn't got some of those structured elements in there that we could just let go of, if that makes sense. So research methods then. Coming on to sort of how then I worked with this, I utilised a process-led reflexive practice so that I could explore a deeper engagement for myself within the filmmaking practice. So as I was going through it, an embedded researcher, but at the centre doing it. I was drawing off methodology from my sociology background, really. I started off doing some sociology at undergraduate, partly because I was told not to do a film and media degree, even way back then. My master's was in social and cultural theory, which was absolutely amazing. So that had all of this stuff embedded into it, and these sociological methodology, really. And then I took that into the PhD, and it became the bedrock of my PhD. Here I used an auto-ethnographic approach, so taking field notes and conducting audio-visual interviews, and also myself as this embedded researcher. But it was a challenge because obviously, I'm the filmmaker as well. I'm at the center of it. I'm the director and I'm producing as well. I did have a kind of producer / production manager throughout shooting it, but only when we were shooting, really. So this method only ever captures part of the experience, even if you've filmed everything. You've not filmed it from every angle. So it doesn't capture the whole, and I'm fine with that. I've always been fine with that. But I continually draw from the fragments of data as well as my own memory as that embedded researcher, and also by interacting with other scholars in terms of their work and reading their work and going back and reading, and audience engagement with the film. So through this dynamic, reflexive approach, I am critically engaging with concerns around the relationship between collaborators and myself within the production environment. So as the researcher, I aim to capture and understand the key creative choices I made throughout this production, and that's major, really. Obviously, it wasn't carte blanche everything. I was interested in the key creative choices. And then being the director, my priority was to achieve this authenticity through fostering a connection with the cast and crew as we made these creative choices on our journey to make the film. So crucially, I sought to avoid manipulating the audience's emotional journey. So that was one of my key things, not to manipulate the audience on when to feel sad, happy, whatever it might be, or to feel in a certain way, and just present a moment in time for the audience to just take in and have time to think about within the film. So there's an essence of slow cinema in this as well, although I would say slightly different. So in terms of methods, my concerns around authenticity led me back to visual anthropology, which greatly influenced my doctoral thesis. I aim to avoid overemphasizing sound, visuals, or music to dictate audience emotion, while acknowledging that nothing we create transcends representation. So experimental filmmaker Trinity Minhar does not seek authenticity in the conventional sense, but rather a truthfulness in her practice. And that was what I was really interested in. So although I'm not coming at it from Trin's documentary stance, she's coming at it from documentary, moving towards a more poetic representation within her films. I'm coming at it at fiction, wanting the authenticity, but not wanting to go into some kind of social realism, or the fact that I'm trying to create something more realistic for the audience. I'm okay. I know that representation is representation at the end of the day. So for those of you who don't know her work, Trin comes out of documentary, as I've said, but blurs the line between documentary and a more poetic representation. Trin's background is in visual anthropology, filmmaking, and literature, and they all shape her approach to her subjects as she challenges traditional ethnographic practices and emphasises the limitations and subjectivity inherent in representation. So Trin is critiquing the authority of objective observation within the visual anthropology area and within documentary practice, advocating instead for a dialogic relational perspective. She talks about, I do not intend to speak about, just speak nearby. And this really shaped my PhD, but it also shaped me as a director, because as a director, I want to honour the story and the characters. Just because they're not real people, they could represent an empathy that a real person has with that material. So I feel just as ethically responsible to tell a story in a way that has a truthfulness and authenticity, a way of being that is rooted in some genuine articulation, really. So it really speaks to me still today, and that's why it's important to my fiction filmmaking, really, Trin's way of thinking about things. It's this dialogic relationship and the speaking nearby rather than dictating, which intrigues me. And her filmmaking is grounded in this embodied experience and self-reflection. And I wanted to captivate that and bring that into the fiction sphere and my filmmaking. So, as I said, her works it deeply resonates in me still to this day. This truthfulness, which is rooted in the processes and the practice of making, as well as in the artifact itself. And it's, for me, the collective engagement and that shared artistic vision that's really important. So her perspective, I really like this bit too, challenges fixed meaning or static truths. It's shaped my approach that whatever people and the audience get from the film is theirs. It's very precious to them, but also they could talk to somebody else and have a conversation and a dialogue about what that is, or perhaps what they don't understand. And in this, then, we are creating to understand, and we're understanding. And the understanding is to recreate when we recreate something. So it's about really where we started with a writer and an event and then a script. And then that script, looking at it, understanding it and recreating it, which fascinates me. And it's this act of creation and the process of understanding which are profoundly intertwined and reciprocal. And I come at this seeing it as intellectual work. It makes sense to me that when we are striving to do something that is original and we are trying to recreate out of a script and put collaborative choices together, that we are creating new knowledge. So it's this collaborative act of creation becomes a means of comprehension. So suggesting that knowledge is not just acquired passively, but actively shaped through creative engagement. This dynamic extends across all production departments, where interactions with the script and the process of bringing the story to life, whether through lighting or costume. And here, for this moment, this is an actor, this is Josh, the character here, talking with our sound guy. So sound play a vital role, even perhaps where they're talking about mic placement and where then he's walking and his character is going. These are really important negotiations, really. So this second proposition from Trin then, to understand is to recreate, suggests that understanding leads to a continuous reinterpretation of what we know of the story. In a collaborative process, this reinterpretation happens repeatedly as creatives reach a perceived cohesive vision. And it is perceived until we've set it in stone and we've filmed it and put the edit together and then screened it. This means that understanding, when shared, leads to a unique recreation of the story the writer was trying to articulate. Trin's perspective emphasises nuanced, process-orientated meaning making, and this was pivotal for me, as the poetic nature of the script required an interpretation shaped not only by myself, but the collaborative decisions as well as by the compromises inherent in working within the means of production. And boy, were there a lot of compromises on this set. For Trin, creation and understanding are ongoing, cyclical processes, suggesting that knowledge and creativity are fluid and interconnected in every part of the process. Understanding that every act of collaboration shifts how we perceive and present a story, leading to new forms of creation, therefore new knowledge, making the film itself an output. So with that, I think we should have a look at a clip. So about the night then centres on Josh, this young waiter, as he ends his shift and tries to close up for the night. As I mentioned, my goal was to create an engaging narrative that captures life's complexities without adhering to a conventional conflict resolution arc. The tension is evident when Mia enters as Josh is closing for the night, yet there is no overt conflict. Even when Mia avoids eye contact and communicates only through writing. So the subtle shift in Josh's behaviour from initial annoyance to acceptance, as we don't find out because we haven't gone that far, influenced by his desire to emulate his mentor Elijah. Underscores a narrative that unfolds without a dramatic catalyst. Now, with the focus on minimal manipulation, fostering empathy without dictating audience emotions, the sonic elements had to be carefully thought through, as it needed to enhance rather than compensate from the absence of conflict. And I could go on much more. It was a great process that I went through with the sound designer and acousmatic artist. So I think there may be one little note played on a synth, but other than that, everything else is found sound design kind of material. It's real sound that she's played around with to create that track, but I don't have time here unless you want to ask later. So this reflexive process then is really interesting. Barbara Bolt really helped me here articulate this, and I got to her through Catherine Grant's stuff on video essays. And it just is brilliant stuff. She's drawing from Heidegger, arguing that the traditional emphasis on completed artworks rather than the practice itself creates a significant gap in our understanding of art as a dynamic, evolving process. Bolt introduced the concept of material thinking, which she defines as a way of considering the relationships that take place within the very process or tissue of making. I love that. And as I have said, filmmaking is inherently complex, marked by numerous points where the process can be disrupted or compromised, and sometimes it's completely broken down. By critically examining these complexities, we gain a deeper appreciation of the collaborative dynamics, the stressful, resource-intense nature of production, and then the crucial question becomes, who is afforded the opportunity to take on these creative roles, particularly the role of director? So through this reflexive practice, or this process, I can now start to fully understand and articulate the whole experience, but I'm still doing that as I go through, working through writing and doing outputs. It keeps on coming. It's fantastic. Something that really was striking was this notion coming from Rod Stoneman about uncertainty, chance, and risk, something he wrote quite a while ago that I found. But it helps to think about the process, really, and what a strange process it is, and how little we know about the process as well. And I'll come back to that in a moment, though. With the production process being so complex, prone to friction, I'll also come back to that as well, and disruptions, filmmaking is a highly precarious venture for all who dare to participate. It's interesting, really, because it's often seen, filmmaking is, as a form of alchemy, a fusion of innate talent, craft skills, and serendipity. And this research calls actually for a rethink of our approach to both the practice and the pedagogy of teaching filmmaking. While this mystique can create intrigue for your product and marketing, good marketing, it ultimately proves unhelpful, perpetuating the cult of the director and overshadowing the collaborative efforts crucial to production. So while this concept isn't new of film being a kind of intellectual pursuit, or what we do is being critical and evaluative, Eisenstein described filmmaking as a blend of creative vision, intellectual analysis, and emotional engagement. I feel few have really taken flight with what this actually means whilst making, and then been able to write about it. I think we're getting somewhere these days with different people talking about the process. A lot of work has been done on script writing, which is fabulous, and I've drawn quite a bit of stuff from that research. But we need more people to discuss the ins and outs and intricacies and complexities of filmmaking, and especially around creative choices and vision. And today I feel this project is still only scratching the surface, with lots more to uncover about the complexities of the process, engaging with filmmakers' filmmaking's complex components, as it requires a dynamic interplay of knowledge, understanding, and intuition. So, since creativity and understanding are deeply entwined in filmmaking, it's crucial to recognise that the intricate creativity and technical decisions involved come with a cost, not just in terms of finance or reputation, but emotional as well. This research continues to highlight to me that the deeply embedded collaborative nature of film production needs constant revision to understand the complexities of the production situation. I'm not quite sure within an industrial context whether that just doesn't happen. But this project has allowed me to articulate what I previously understood intrinsically or intuitively, making both the film and this articulation valuable outcomes in their own right. I have also come to understand that emphasis on the creative voice in filmmaking, and believe me, as an educator, I have lent on this a lot. It just reinforces the elitist structure within industry, limiting diversity and diverse content creation. The auteur theory promotes the idea that a singular artistic vision defines a film as art, but this is restrictive, relying on a problematic criteria for who qualifies. Both Perlman and Shambu note that this emphasis on the auteur promotes a colonial and Eurocentric approach to production and prioritises individualism and hierarchical control over the collaborative creativity involved in much of filmmaking, particularly in a Western context. So this is where the concept of risk becomes a major factor, as the ongoing process of refining and reimagining brings untold risk, therefore limiting opportunities even before exploring innovative storytelling. Stoneman states we need to encourage and maximise the dynamic of the daring, the possibilities of the perilous, in order to enable the realisation of new images and sounds that may contribute to social and cultural transformation. Brilliant. Stoneman advocates for dangerous creation to foster new, transformative work, but this approach often clashes with the priorities of industry and raises questions about the use of creative voice within a pedagogical context. I haven't got an answer to that quite yet. What was revealed to me through this journey is that filmmaking is risky and in so many more ways than I'd actually understood before embarking on this journey. So About the Night then was made in a relatively safe environment, yet most filmmakers lack this security. I just don't feel like we talk about this often enough. What this research highlights is that filmmaking is inherently marked by setbacks, with critical moments emerging as story needs are balanced against real-world constraints. Each contributor must negotiate and redefine their contributions to achieve the final product. To remove barriers for aspiring filmmakers, however, it's not only about providing adequate knowledge and training, but also about creating safe working environments that understand and mitigate these high risks, particularly to the emotional well-being of people, allowing promising creatives to thrive and gain professional opportunities. We need to fully understand production dynamics to challenge existing practices and foster innovation beyond the dominant auteur approach, emulating this within our pedagogy is really important instead of emulating industry practice, if that makes sense. It's quite big, that one. And I can talk to that a little bit more later if you like. So as I mentioned, my primary objective as the director was to depict fictional events with minimal manipulation, aiming to foster empathy without imposing emotions on the audience, rather than striving for this naturalistic representation. So my approach was to construct this experiential window that mirrored the evocative tone of the script, inviting the audience into a subtly crafted moment. This seemingly restrained approach to fiction was not intended to merely document a moment. My aim was to experiment with narrative fiction, filmic form. So I just wanted to briefly mention, and it is briefly, a notion that has come to me again afterwards and in doing papers, really, is this notion of friction rather than conflict. So while the notion of friction had not been employed in the context of my research from the start, it has emerged as an apt descriptor for the challenges inherent in both the collaborative creative process and in understanding the driving force behind the narrative conventions employed in the story. So here I want to briefly focus on friction as an alternative to the notion of conflict. So conflict basically is, we are told, is inherent in all stories. It's the cornerstone of storytelling and continues to play a key component that shapes narrative structures and engages audiences by creating tension, suspense and resolution. So although friction and conflict are related concepts, they are often misused interchangeably, but they are actually distinct. Here's why. Conflict typically refers to a more intense and direct clash or disagreement between parties. It frequently involves opposing interests, goals, or values, which within a narrative typically culminates in overt confrontation, hostility, or struggle. Whereas friction generally refers to tension, disagreement, or resistance between individuals or groups. As opposed to conflict, friction can be relatively mild and may not necessarily escalate into open confrontation or hostility. However, we are taught that conflict is the only way a story can be formed. And my aim with this film was to experiment with the narrative of the story, creating friction rather than conflict. Now, you haven't seen the whole thing, so it is a lot to take in when you watch the film. It is quite different because of that. Now, I want to just briefly mention this because I'm aware I'm kind of running out of time, and I'm also running a little bit out of steam of listening to myself, I must say. I much prefer to listen to some of your questions, but this is really important to me because this has been with me for quite some time, really. This notion of the collaborative creative process, really. And this dynamic of friction also comes into the making of and the practices of. So that if this risk in filmmaking of when we make something, there is such a high risk that we have to mitigate all kind of conflicts. If we also mitigate friction, we might also mitigate some innovative practice as well. So this is talking about the practices now within our creative decision making, so that friction is often seen as a hindrance, when I'm saying it can be a powerful driver for creativity and innovation. So despite the desire for a smooth process, filmmaking is invariably marked by setbacks, so that that things don't happen. The pandemic halted our production for over a year, and it profoundly impacted the crew and the cast and the final product, really. And as a director, every creative decision is a negotiation with the collaborators. So having to constantly balance the story with the needs and the budget constraints actually leads to inevitable compromises. So I kind of thought this through, really, and the dynamic really of this creative process, that this is one of my outputs in some way, is that where creativity, which is our intent, what we want to do with the content, the story, the script, it has to meet the compromises, the reality. And in that intersection, we get this dynamic creativity when we collaborate, and it pushes what we have, and the story kind of comes out through those points, those intersections, really, and through people as we intersect. And this is what makes, I feel, filmmaking and teaching filmmaking so exciting. So it also makes it a very high stakes environment. And that's my other point. And it highlights the pressures that directors and really key creatives in this process are under. And you can see why a risk-averse culture stifles the creative possibilities and narrows the scope of who gets to be taking those choices, making those choices, and what kind of choices. And I think we really need to rethink this. And perhaps we can start doing that within our filmmaking. I'm going to wrap up. I just wanted to say that I've started to, I'll just skip that slide, started to now find out about the carrier bag theory of fiction, and interacting with some Ursula K. Le Guin's work here. If you don't know about it, it's a different way of thinking about narrative structure. It is within prose in literature, but it's about valuing collective experience over individual heroics. And it has been such a joy to get involved and to understand this work and her work, as she started out writing Hero's Journey and became very famous in the 70s for her sci-fi books, to then put that aside and say, I can't do this anymore. I need to walk in my own vision. I need to walk in my own shoes. And that's really what this process has done for us, is and me particularly has made me more confident to step outside of what I understood and the conventions and the constraints really of narrative form within fiction. So basically, this practice-led research has, I'll skip to that last slide, has really opened my eyes to what I've got and being able to articulate it, and it will change me forever, really. So despite challenges about the night, stands as the research output, achieving an authenticity through collaborative negotiation. It marks the first phase in this research. I hope there'll be more, and capturing the material negotiations that honour the writer's intent. And the outcome, I feel, is greater than the sum of its parts, and it resonates with audiences who kind of want to enter into that interesting, different experience. And it doesn't resonate with others. It does have to be said. We can talk a bit more about that. But yeah, that's me. And there's bibliography of stuff if it's needed. Wow, there we go.
Thank you so much, Lee Jane. It was just such a pleasure to listen to you. And I have to say that your talk really just responds in so many ways to the very reasons I started this seminar. So because not only your film is absolutely beautiful, and I don't think it's a problem to share with everyone. I just absolutely fell in love with Lee Jane's film when I saw it for the first time. And this is really very recently started collaborating with so many different things. I think it's a beautiful film. But what makes it so special that you are a very accomplished academic and you actually managed to make a beautiful film and really fantastic research at the same time and talk about both the process, your role within a kind of wider filmmaking context within academia and the industry and festival circuits, and research in such a really, really fantastic way. It really is very rare, and I just find it really incredible because you just answer to so many things or kind of points which I think are absolutely essential in this kind of talks. And there's not that many examples I'm aware of which can be compared to that, and also the way you talk about it. So thank you. It was absolutely a pleasure to hear you talk. Now I have a bazillion of questions, and I know that I will probably bother you with some of them outside of this meeting, but I'm just going to start with one or two, if that's okay, and I will open it to other people because I'm sure there will be more questions. So inevitably, I'm going to go back to one of the points you've mentioned, and you've mentioned it on several occasions. So this idea of, at what point did you start, not even thinking about your research question, but even the fact that this film will be actually leading you to some sort of research. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is whether your film as an idea came first, and then you thought, well, actually, there's so much potential over there, and I can think about both the process and the way I collaborate with my with people who work with me, the way I can actually relate it to so many different ways of telling the story through different filmmaking techniques, but also in relation to methodologies. You quite nicely talked about it, the idea of self-reflexive autoethnography and all just so many things over there. Or have you started, well, actually, I'm an academic, I'm a filmmaker as well, but I'm just going to start with some ideas I want to explore through my filmmaking. And I know you kind of come back to this throughout your talk, but I'm just really interested what came first. And I know it might be a chicken and egg situation, and probably you thought about both of them at the same time. But I'm just really curious how that developed.
Yeah, really the idea and the story came first. Yeah, quite simply. And the script. The writer wrote the script, but it was such a beautiful but different script. So that working on it, it dawned on me that as a creative, he had interacted with those two moments, events, and reading Ernest Hemingway, A Clean and Well Lit Place. I think I've got that right. I often get it wrong. And his creativity brought out a script, right? He didn't think about story structure. He did. It was just what inspires him, and he does write really good atmospheric kind of scripts as well. So they don't need to be plot driven for him. So it was really lovely to read that script, think it was beautiful, but then think that I needed to shape it in a better way because of my teaching, what I'm teaching, because of what I know and I've been taught, and I have this kind of prescribed way that I've at this point I've not fully articulated that that's what I'm doing, and I just thought that the research kind of, because it took so long to really work on that script, and we did it through love and pleasure, and snatching time and being creative whilst, a big chunk of it was done whilst we were living in Portland, having a horrendous time having moved out to the States. And our son was going off to Pokemon tournaments, and we'd go and talk about this script in a cafe. It sort of grounded us. But so the research side started to slowly dawn on me. And then coming back to work in the UK, and teaching and feeling so far removed, and teaching production, and I'm not doing production. It was a way to make me feel legitimate. I hadn't understood how much I would understand about the processes if I had my researcher brain switched on whilst doing it. It's really quite illuminating because you intrinsically learn stuff, and then you intrinsically start teaching it, and it makes sense to you. And I kind of teach in a quite a it's not an emotional way, but a feely kind of way, so that I'm often going, oh, I've got goosebumps now, I've got goosebumps, I'm feeling it, and the students would go, oh, all right, she's got goosebumps, that's really good. So it was about, the research side was about switching on the understanding side, and just having that little bit of a step back moment, and not always. Obviously, during production, I wasn't stepping back, but I was taking a moment to write stuff down. That's only one of the books, of the many books. But jotting down what I could. I didn't jot down my days, what I did. I just jotted down, that was hard. This was a difficult decision, or So really the research started to burgeon out of thinking that this is an unusual process that we're going through, unusual script. I'm trying to put more traditional stuff in there. And then at one point during the edit, as I say, I gained confidence in the material and went, you know, do you know what? This thing needs to be what it needs to be. The writer had been quite confident in how he wrote it at the start, and then he kind of came along on my journey of collaborating, and we kind of negotiated, added certain things in. I haven't yet unpicked really, because the echoes of that traditional, it being about Josh, that wasn't necessarily the focus of the original script, but that we have him, not her. You know, there's loads of creative choices that have been made that can still be analysed really, but at this moment in time I'm kind of, you know, I'm fleshing this out bigger and bigger as we go along.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. And from what you said towards the end, like obviously the kind of the research discovery is still happening to some degree. The more you think about it, which is really beautiful, because again, your research is not, as I said, it's not a beautiful film, but it's a very rigorous research, and it's really nice because, you know, in relation to all this conversation we all have all the time about, you know, theory versus practice, what comes first, and things like that. And obviously your example is just such a beautiful illustration of how organically it happens, and how sometimes you just have to go with the process. And obviously the massive role of reflexive practice, as I've mentioned before, is where you create this kind of friction between what you know and what you do organically and kind of chaotically to some degree, and then at some point these two things merge, and the research happens, if you like. I think this is how I see that.
I mean, what's fascinating is I think that I'm very much, and I've been articulating this for a long time within my teaching, is that it's a doing and a thinking, and thinking and a doing and a rethinking, and you know, they don't live separately for me. It's integrated theory and practice, because my mentor Christine Gledhill, and you still is really for my PhD and still in life and academia. She once said to me, "And you think that writing an essay isn't doing?" And you're like, yeah, of course it is. You've taken in, and then you're just doing something and just shaping that into an argument. Absolutely. Become, you know, it solidifies the learning. And this was exactly the same. As much as I could stand in front of and teach filmmaking, it has made me such a different teacher by just doing it, let alone the research that I can articulate from having these data sets. It is quite, and you're right, you know, the research discoveries keep happening, and I love that. I never imagined that.
Apologies about my dog. Sarah, do you want to go next? And I think we have a comment from Matthew, who I think had to leave earlier, and then I have another question if we can squeeze it in, but go ahead, Sarah.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Agatha. Hi, Lee Jane. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was amazing. So much in it. It's hard to know where to begin, but just picking so I just stuck my hand up there because you were talking about how, you know, how you're constantly, even after all the process, and there's so much to unpick about that I'd love to talk to you about in more detail. But what I was going to perhaps just mention is I've just recently completed a short film research project as well, which has been quite transformative in the way that I relate to my own teaching practice as well, specifically, because I've been teaching filmmaking for quite some years now, like over sort of nearly 15 years now. I started off as a filmmaker, then I've kind of did a PhD in creative writing, then I've come back to filmmaking very much for similar reasons, because I was beginning to feel like I really needed to connect with that practice again, because I'm continuing, you know, continuing to teach it. And it's really going through this process for me has also really reshaped my practice and the kind of filmmaker the kind of filmmaking teaching that I'm doing now is much more, is really informed by the work that I have done. Can you? No. Sorry, my son's just attacking me now. He's chosen the right moment to come and attack me. No, go away. It's
the right height for it. Oh, bless. Oh, bless.
You muted, Sarah.
Yeah.
Okay, so timing. I'm just going to come back to you and try and shoo my son away. Half term. So I can really connect to that, and I find it all fascinating. But what and the fact that you're always constantly discovering new things about the research as well, that is kind of exemplified in the fact that you know the research question that you posed at the beginning, you very transparently said, this is not the tidy research question I had at the beginning of my process. This is the one that I've arrived at now at the end. And I think that those factors are really key to share, and I don't think there is very much sharing of that kind of that sort of invention and discovery as you go through the filmmaking process. And it's just you know, it's just super to hear the way that you, and as Agatha said, you know, you're so, you know, the film looks amazing. I'd love to see the whole piece, but being able to articulate it in that way with the research framework, I don't really see that happening anywhere else. So I don't really have a question. I'm just sort of recognizing a lot of what you're talking about in my own work, and I'm also excited for reading more about it going forward. So thank you very much for that.
Amazing. Thank you, Sarah. Well, I'm gonna read Matthew's question, because he said he loves your work and the concepts you're developing are really wonderful and important. He's very sorry he has to leave for another appointment, but he will be a bit cheeky and put a question in the chat, which is what I'm reading right now. Then if we get to it, he will catch it on the YouTube stream. Thanks again. And the question is about screenwriting. What is your approach to writing? Or can you envisage an approach to writing a script, in inverted commas, then somehow eschews the industry's recognized forms of the screenplay? The form of the screenplay can be sometimes restrictive, and a form of the screenplay, either consciously or unconsciously, tends towards imposing a conventional structure upon us. Interesting question, which actually I'm gonna be tricky right now, because I'm gonna marry this question with my question, because it links to some degree. So Matthew is asking pretty much about the same in relation to the script, and my question is, you know, why do you think there's so many restrictions for fiction filmmaking? This is where you started the talk, really. And I guess this is something we will be exploring in a book we're writing, but I'm kind of interested, because what Matthew is asking about is this kind of restrictive view of screenplays. But, you know, if we take it bigger and talk about fiction filmmaking, how do you see it?
Yeah, it's tough. It's a big money-making business, right? So, I mean, you know, even if we were to go to through the levels, obviously we've got massive Hollywood, massive productions, lots of money, lots of ridiculous amounts of money. But let's go to even art house films now, indie films. They've become so kind of high level, you know, and quite high budgets as such as to what used to be. Very little mid-range anymore, very little low budget stuff. And so the conventions and the ways of putting things together, whether it's in a script or format or your storytelling format, are to mitigate risk. It's to, you know, it's a long process, it's a long development time. You know, even the big boys, in inverted commas, being Hollywood, and I know I'm saying boys because it mostly is can be 5 years. It's not a quick process. So money is a massive factor, and so it's a way of controlling and keeping a certain content alive. And so you know, in Hollywood and for Marvel films and big films, blockbusters, okay, it makes sense. I can see how it makes sense, but they go wildly over budget anyway. But that's a different kind of filmmaking. But when we come down the ladders, it's just permeated. This risk-averse culture has permeated all the way now down to short films and festivals.
Yeah.
The festivals that I've had work screened at before, because I've been a filmmaker for quite some time, got a few, you know, had a number of short fiction films out there on the festival circuit. Nobody wanted to show this film. It was too different. It's too, don't understand it. A big festival that I thought would be fine, and I won't mention it, you know, just went, no, thanks. And I went, oh my goodness, okay, any chance for any feedback? So they did get me feedback. They weren't going to, but they did. And they just misjudged it. They just couldn't understand how it didn't fit into a traditional pattern. And you know, even down to saying it wasn't show and tell.
Yeah, you know, I have a comment, if you don't mind me kind of jumping in, because I really think that in that sense, when we think from that perspective, the fact that you're actually working within an academic context and make it into some kind of research is actually quite helpful, because obviously when it comes to research, we are judged by the by original contribution to knowledge. So you think about how to do things differently, not just how to produce yet another film, which obviously no one has done before, but how to actually do something differently. And you've been talking in quite beautiful way about what this new way of thinking for you were in this film. So, you know, the way you collaborate with your crew, but also the way you create a story, the way you challenge the traditional way of narrative and storytelling. So many different things. It would be enough for 4 PhDs really. So you know, maybe we are actually quite fortunate as people kind of sit on this kind of border between these two, because it forces us, if we want to consider our filmmaking in these categories, it forces us to find something different. But also at the same time, I mean, this is going to be a really kind of obvious thing to state, but I cannot stop myself from just saying it loud, that it's just this kind of approach you've just described in terms of big budget Hollywood movies is just basically completely killing the creativity, because you cannot have a template and repeat the same pattern and yet have something which is interesting. So it obviously stands at a stark opposition to what we're just talking about in relation to academic context. Obviously the challenge is that for many people is quite impossible, and this is both what myself and Sarah just underlined. It's very, very difficult to actually come up with beautiful filmmaking and good research. So this is really what, you know, is I would argue a struggle in general. That's why I think your work is so important here. Just, you know, as an example of, you know, practice which can be successful in both categories, because very often it might be, and I in my book write quite a lot about that, you know, most of the time when you're thinking about your film as research and you're building a new way of something, very often it doesn't really have to be a good film, but of course I would prefer for it to be. It's just I'm being realistic, you know. It's in this kind of context we do not have big budgets, as you rightly said, and we very often people just, you know, lack so many different resources. So it is usually a struggle or challenge, and you have to usually prioritize one over the other. So when you do prioritize the filmmaking itself and you get some bigger budget, then you are forced to go with those compromises you've mentioned, and you might have to be less creative or less innovative, if you like, just because you need to please someone who's giving you money. Now, and this again, people who talked in this seminar before, such as Yakavos Panagopoulos, who was talking about the same context in Greek environment, just talked about exactly the same, how in order to get any money for his film, he has to completely sell his soul to the devil and just basically make somebody else's film almost, because it will be, changed to such a degree that he doesn't really recognize it as his own film anymore almost. And it is obviously the only way for many people to get there. And you know, it's not ideal. So I don't know. I don't want to finish with this kind of pessimistic note. But I wonder if you have any comment on that.
The positive note is, I think there's a lot of stuff we can be doing if we all start making and just start thinking about our process. Like Sarah was saying, it's transformative. If you see yourself as an embedded researcher within your making, you are going to come out with something that is interesting, because inevitably, I think if you think about your creative process, the way that you've rubbed up against the compromises in order to make your film. So this notion of your creative intent meeting the story, and then the compromises you have to make mean that, if you can document that and talk about that, we will learn from that. I think it will be transformative, both for the person, I think, and then if they could write that up into some form of research, we will start learning a lot more. I can't do it all on my own. I can't, even if I get 2 more short films, and I have no money, by the way, anybody would like to. I've got a brilliant mermaid story about a siren for my next one. But if we all started, we'd start to get a really good sense of this complex picture of all these component parts for something that people call art. Film is art, and something that is so important, that shapes people's lives, fears, and it's who, fiction is, it's us. It is just made up. Even the latest Marvel film, honestly, has something to say about us and humanity, right?
I know we ran out of time, so I will wrap it up, but just wanted to kind of, and I will read Sarah's comment before we wrap it up. But I just want to say, like, this is probably for a conversation outside here, but kind of want to, for people who will be watching this online, just to say that I think it's quite telling as well that there's not that many fiction films kind of in this kind of research categories, really. So we discuss it, and that's one of the reasons we're writing the book, or editing and writing the book. We do is because most of the time, and again, I love fiction, non-fiction as well. It's fantastic, and it's a great way of telling stories. But it's quite striking that there's not that many fiction filmmakers who consider their fiction films as research, and I think it's very important. And I wish we had time to talk about it, but again, I'm sure there's going to be more opportunities. Perhaps you should come back and do another talk for the seminar at some point. I'm just going to read Sarah's comment, and I'm just going to announce what happens next week. So Sarah says, an industry director just said to me, do you want to say it, Sarah, since you're still here? Do you want to just unmute yourself very quickly?
Yeah, well, I know it's just when you were talking about the difficulty of telling stories outside of that, 3 acts Sidfield kind of like structural model in anywhere outside of academia, because of the risk factors, the money factors, the kind of the economic factors that shape those processes. You were talking about that, and I just had I've got an industry. She's a high-end TV drama director. She's really struggling to get work at the moment. Lots of directors going up for the same job. She's really struggling, and she was actually sort of saying, she was actually slightly envious. She said, I'm quite jealous of you guys at the moment, because in academia you've got a chance to sort of experiment more. You can present a framework for a different kind of filmmaking, a different kind of way of telling stories. Obviously it's not that easy to get money to make these kind of projects, as we all know from inside it, but you can see also in the grass is perhaps always a little bit greener, but there are potentially more opportunities to make work that tests what those traditional storytelling patterns are.
Definitely.
And I think that's all I was saying. But then I would love to talk to you about the implications for education as well, like for pedagogy, and how, thinking more, kind of sort of destroying the walls of this creative voice idea, this kind of the myth of the auteur filmmaker, with a closer inspection on the different types of creative processes that take place within film practice. And I think as we talk more about fiction filmmaking as researchers, hopefully it'll be more transparent and more evident, the way that we can sort of bring that into pedagogy. I think that would be an exciting development too, which clearly you're thinking about a lot too.
Yeah.
So thank you again. Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you so much. And just a quick announcement that Matthew, who was here with us, Matthew Hawkins from London South Bank University, will be our next speaker next month. And he will be talking about experimental fiction filmmaking. So very closely related subject to what we talk about today. And the subtitle is Notes on a Creative Practice Methodology. So I think it's going to be quite interesting. And thank you, Molly, for the comments. Such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much. Once again, million times thank you, Lee Jane. It was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Molly. And thank you, everyone else. Have a great whatever time of the day it is for you. And I will see you next month. And a week. Yes. Thank you.
Okay,
bye. Bye. Bye.